Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. This time, we're going to be looking at some potential future policies and international relations, all based on a pretty interesting Q&A you sent me.
Yeah, this is it's definitely a fascinating document. I mean, full of potential policy shifts, really is. It's important to analyze not just what was said, but also like the context and the potential consequences, like what could actually happen if these policies were to be implemented.
Right, from the start, they're talking about 6 potential commutations, and they say that some of these could even be upgraded to pardons.
Yeah, and it's important to remember the difference there, right? A commutation reduces a person's sentence, and it's often based on things like rehabilitation or maybe like evolving societal views on the crime they were convicted of. But a pardon, on the other hand, basically wipes the slate clean.
So that's a huge difference.
Huge difference for the individuals involved and for the justice system as a whole.
Absolutely. Then they get into a planned executive order, and this one aims to reshape the U.S. refugee admission program.
Yeah, they want to align it with the, quote, American principles and interests, and that's a very loaded statement.
It is. What are those principles we're talking about here, and whose interest are we actually prioritizing?
That's the question, isn't it? Like, to really get at the potential impact of this, we need to look at how the program currently operates and the principles that guide it.
Right. And then how might they redefine those principles?
Exactly. And what could that mean for refugees, trying to enter the U.S.? It also raises questions about how other countries might perceive these changes.
And then it gets into a potential policy shift that feels like it could have even bigger global implications.
Oh, yeah.
They're talking about designating drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations.
Wow.
And when asked about the possibility of sending U.S. Special Forces into Mexico, the response was, stranger things have happened.
That's a pretty dramatic escalation.
It feels like a major escalation.
Absolutely. I mean, designating cartels as terrorist organizations would give them access to a whole new set of tools and strategies.
Including potential military intervention.
Exactly, and we've seen that approach with groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, but applying it to cartels raises a whole host of questions like, how would this impact the war on drugs?
What would it mean for the relationship between the U.S. and Mexico?
How would other countries in the region react? It's a lot to consider.
So from potential military action, we jump to potential changes in the legal definition of birthright citizenship.
Yeah, and specifically targeting the 14th Amendment.
They seem very confident that there are good grounds for making these changes, but that feels massive to me.
It is. I mean, the 14th Amendment is a cornerstone of U.S. citizenship, guaranteeing that anyone born on U.S. soil is automatically a citizen.
Changing that would be a fundamental shift.
Exactly, in how we define citizenship, and it would likely face major legal challenges and could have a huge impact on families and individuals across the country.
I mean, imagine, for example, if the children of undocumented immigrants, even if they were born in the U.S., were no longer automatically citizens.
Right. That could create a whole new class of residents without a clear path to citizenship. It's a huge can of worms.
And then there's the talk of a proclamation declaring a national emergency at the southern border.
Stating what they call the unprecedented admission of illegal aliens.
What does declaring a national emergency actually do?
Well, it unlocks certain powers and resources for the executive branch.
So it gives them special powers.
In a way, yeah, it's typically used in times of crisis, but invoking it for immigration control is very controversial.
Right, because normally you think of national emergencies like for natural disasters or wartime.
Right. There's a clear sense of urgency there.
Applying that same framework to immigration raises a lot of questions.
About executive overreach for sure, and it could significantly reshape immigration policy and how it's enforced.
And now switching gears to global issues for a minute, the Q&A discusses NATO and the need for member countries to increase their contributions, aiming for 5% of their GDP.
That's a pretty specific demand.
And a lot of money for some countries.
It is. It would represent a significant increase in financial burden for many NATO members.
Only a few countries meet that 5% target right now.
Right. And demanding that all members contribute that much would probably lead to some pushback and a lot of debate within the alliance.
It also raises questions about how these funds would be used.
And whether it would actually impact NATO's overall strategy and effectiveness.
And of course, we have the ongoing war in Ukraine.
They mention a possible peace proposal from China and Brazil and even talk about speaking directly with Putin and Zelensky.
So we've got economics, we've got diplomacy. This is a complex situation.
It's a tangled web for sure. Analyzing any potential peace proposal requires understanding the motivations of all parties involved. What concessions might each side be willing to make?
What are the possible obstacles to reaching a peaceful resolution? The stakes are incredibly high.
Not just for Ukraine and Russia, but for the whole world.
And from potential peace talks, we jump right into potential trade wars. They're discussing possible tariffs, 25% on both Mexico and Canada.
And then there's the mention of a 100% tariff on BRICS nations.
Can you remind me what BRICS nations are again?
Yeah, BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa.
So some major players.
Major emerging economies with significant global influence. A 100% tariff on their goods would essentially shut down trade between the U.S. and those countries.
To understand the logic behind this, we need to consider the history of trade wars.
Absolutely. I mean, think back to the U.S. and China trade war just a few years ago. They imposed tariffs on billions of dollars worth of each other's goods, and it hurt businesses and consumers on both sides.
So a 100% tariff on BRICS nations would be a huge escalation.
A dramatic escalation in economic confrontation and could have far-reaching consequences for the global economy. It's hard to overstate the potential impact.
It's pretty wild to think about the scope of these potential policy changes. They even mention Greenland.
And how we need it for international security.
What's behind that statement, do you think?
Well, Greenland's strategic location in the Arctic and its vast natural resources make it a point of interest for several countries, including the U.S.
So maybe it's about countering the growing influence of Russia and China in the region.
It could be. It also raises questions about the potential environmental impact of increased activity in the Arctic.
Right, because that's a very fragile ecosystem.
Absolutely. And then, almost casually, the Q&A mentions withdrawing the U.S. from the World Health Organization.
That feels like a pretty big deal.
It is. The WHO plays a crucial role in global health cooperation, especially in responding to pandemics like the one we all just experienced.
Withdrawing from the WHO would be a major step.
A signal of retreat from global health leadership and could hinder efforts to address future health crises.
It also raises questions about U.S. commitment to multilateralism and cooperation on global challenges. Right?
Exactly. It's a statement that would be felt around the world.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here, but we're not done yet. Let's bring it back down to earth for a minute. They talk about inflation and seem to blame energy policy, saying they plan to make a lot of money from energy in tariffs.
There's a complex relationship between energy policy and inflation. Rising energy prices can contribute to overall inflation by increasing the cost of transportation production and everyday goods and services.
But using tariffs as a primary revenue source is controversial, to say the least.
It is. Tariffs are essentially taxes on imported goods.
So while they can generate revenue for the government,
They also tend to raise prices for consumers.
which can lead to a decrease in purchasing power.
And potentially slow economic growth.
And then there's the big question of TikTok.
They talk about selling it, shutting it down completely, or forming a joint venture where the U.S. government gets 50% because they created the value by allowing it to continue operating.
That's a very unique approach, to say the least.
It is highly unusual and raises a lot of questions. There's no clear legal precedent for the government taking an ownership stake in a private company simply because they allowed it to operate.
It raises concerns about government overreach.
And potential interference in the free market, for sure.
And it begs the question, what kind of precedent would this set for other tech companies operating in the U.S.?
Exactly. This could have ripple effects throughout the entire tech industry.
And then, just when you think things can't get any more surprising, they mentioned 2 police officers who went after someone they called an illegal during the January 6th events.
And they say they're looking at giving them a break.
Then there are some very pointed comments about the people who were jailed after the January 6th attacks.
This raises serious concerns about potential interference in judicial processes and the rule of law.
It's essential for public trust in the justice system that cases are handled fairly and impartially, regardless of political considerations.
Absolutely. Suggesting preferential treatment for certain individuals based on their actions during the January 6th events undermines the principles of due process and equal justice under the law. It's a slippery slope.
Wow, that's a lot to digest already, and we're just getting started. What else is in this document?
Oh, there's still plenty to unpack. We've got potential strategies regarding Venezuela, a possible meeting with Putin to discuss Ukraine, and some surprising predictions about the Abrahamic Accords.
We'll dive into those topics and more after a short break. Stay with us. Okay, so before the break, we were looking at some pretty big potential changes. And this document covers a lot of ground, and it feels like with every topic, they're touching on something either controversial or like a potential game changer. So what else did you find?
Well, there's a section on Venezuela,
Oh, yeah?
and they mention halting U.S. oil purchases from Venezuela as a way to pressure Maduro to leave office.
I feel like that could be a double-edged sword, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Like, on one hand, it puts pressure on the Maduro regime, but it could also hurt the Venezuelan people who are already struggling.
Absolutely. That's a crucial question to consider. I mean, Venezuela's economy relies so heavily on oil exports that cutting off a major buyer like the U.S. would have a big impact. So it's really important to weigh the potential effectiveness of a strategy like that against the potential humanitarian consequences.
Right? You don't want to make things worse for the people there. Then they mentioned a possible meeting with Putin.
Yeah, with the goal of ending the conflict in Ukraine as quickly as possible.
I mean, that seems like a very ambitious goal.
It is any potential meeting between those two leaders would be full of challenges and uncertainties.
For sure.
I think it's important to consider the different perspectives and potential outcomes here. What concessions might each side be willing to make?
What are the possible obstacles to reaching a peaceful resolution?
Exactly. And how would other countries involved in the conflict even perceive a meeting like that?
There's also a prediction that Israel and Saudi Arabia will join the Abrahamic Accords this year.
Now, if that happened, it would be a pretty big deal.
Huge in terms of Middle East diplomacy.
Absolutely. It would signal a potential shift in those regional alliances and could maybe open new avenues for cooperation.
So we need to analyze what's driving this potential move and what it could mean for the region as a whole.
Right. What would it mean for stability in the region, and what impact would it have on the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict? There's a lot to unpack there.
Then they talk about unleashing Alaska's potential as an energy reservoir for the entire nation.
That sounds like it could have some major economic and environmental implications.
It does. Alaska has massive oil and gas reserves.
But developing them raises all sorts of questions about the environmental impact and the potential risks of drilling in such a fragile ecosystem.
Of course.
There's also the question of infrastructure development and the cost of transporting those energy resources from Alaska to other parts of the country.
So it's a balancing act.
It is, you have to weigh the potential economic benefits against the potential environmental costs.
And think about the long-term sustainability of a plan like that.
Exactly, because we don't want to just deplete resources without thinking about the future.
Then they get into the European Union, and it seems like they have some strong opinions.
They mention the possibility of either a 25% tariff on EU goods or forcing them to buy U.S. oil and gas to address the trade deficit.
Those are some pretty aggressive stances.
They are. It would be a significant departure from traditional U.S. trade policy with the EU. I mean, they've historically been such a close ally and trading partner.
Taking measures like that would likely strain that relationship.
And probably have negative economic consequences for both sides.
So what's the motivation there?
Right. We need to analyze what's driving these proposed actions and understand the bigger picture of U.S.-EU trade relations.
There's even mention of a potential trip to China in response to an invitation.
That could signal a potential thaw in U.S.-China relations.
But it's hard to know for sure without more information.
It's true. A visit like that would be a big deal, diplomatically speaking.
It could be a sign that they're willing to engage in dialogue.
And maybe address some of those ongoing tensions between the two countries.
But we should approach it with cautious optimism.
I think that's wise. We need to analyze the potential agenda, what each side hopes to get out of it.
And the potential obstacles to actually making progress on things like trade and security and human rights.
Those are some pretty big issues.
And then they bring up tariffs again, talking about this idea of a universal tariff.
They're saying all countries take advantage of the U.S. in trade deals.
So they seem to be advocating for a more protectionist approach to trade.
Yeah, it reflects a view that trade is a zero-sum game, where one country's gain is another country's loss.
But doesn't that perspective kind of overlook the benefits that can come from trade?
I think it does. I mean, when countries specialize in producing goods and services where they have a comparative advantage, it increases efficiency and lowers prices for consumers.
So putting up barriers to trade could disrupt those supply chains.
Exactly, and lead to higher prices for everyone and potentially harm economic growth in the long run.
There's also a section that gets a little more personal where they talk about walking into the Oval Office for the first time.
And they say it was one of the better feelings they've ever had.
I mean, it's interesting to get that little glimpse into their mindset.
It helps us understand what motivates them.
And how those personal experiences might shape their approach to policy and international relations.
Their whole worldview, really. And then they share their perspective on the war in Ukraine.
They seem to believe that Zelensky wants to make a deal with Putin.
But they're not so sure about Putin.
And they say they believe that Putin is destroying Russia by not making a deal.
And that Russia will be in big trouble if they don't find a way to end this conflict.
Those are some pretty strong statements.
They are, and it's important to remember that these are just opinions.
Not necessarily based on verified intelligence or a deep understanding of all the nuances of the conflict.
We need to analyze these statements within the broader context of the war and consider all the different perspectives and potential outcomes.
Then they talk about the situation in Gaza.
They say it's not our war, and they're not confident about keeping the ceasefire.
What do you make of that?
Well, it raises some questions about the U.S. role in mediating the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
And their commitment to actually achieving a lasting peace.
Historically, the U.S. has played a big role in those peace negotiations,
But these statements suggest maybe a shift in approach.
possibly towards disengagement or a more hands-off approach.
So what would the consequences of that be?
We need to analyze what that shift could mean for the region and for the prospects of a peaceful resolution. It's a complex situation with no easy answers.
Then they mention rebuilding Gaza.
But they say they can't imagine it being done with the same leadership.
That sounds like they want regime change.
It does. And suggesting that rebuilding requires new leadership raises concerns about instability and further conflict.
It makes you wonder how they think a change in leadership would happen.
And whether it would actually lead to a better future for Gaza.
It's a risky proposition, for
Yeah.
sure. Then they bring up TikTok again.
Saying they could pressure China into approving a deal by threatening tariffs.
They seem to really like using tariffs as a tool.
They do. It seems to be their go-to solution for a lot of different issues.
It shows you how they think about international relations.
Prioritizing economic leverage and hardball tactics.
But again, what are the consequences of that approach?
We need to think about how effective it will be and what impact it will have on global trade and diplomatic relations.
It's not just about economics, it's about relationships and trust.
Absolutely. And finally, they offer their opinion on other living presidents.
Saying they thought Bill Clinton was a very good politician, but wasn't used properly.
Interesting take. It gives us a little insight into their political views.
And how they perceive other leaders, both past and present.
It adds another layer to understanding their current policies and decisions.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. What are your final thoughts on this document and all the potential changes it lays out?
What stands out to me is this theme of challenging the status quo.
Right.
They want to depart from those established norms and precedents. It's a bold vision for reshaping domestic and international policy, but we need to analyze each proposed action carefully.
Consider all the consequences, both intended and unintended.
Exactly, because actions have reactions, and predicting how other countries will respond is crucial.
Will they see these moves as strength or instability?
Will it lead to cooperation or confrontation? These are the questions we need to be asking as we watch how all of this plays out.
It feels like we're getting a sneak peek at a potential paradigm shift, and it'll be interesting to see how these ideas actually translate into real-world action. What are your thoughts, listener? Which of these potential policy shifts stands out to you as the most surprising or concerning? And what questions do you have about how all of this might impact the U.S. and the world? We'd love to hear your thoughts. I mean, it's a lot to process, right? We've covered everything from potential pardons to TikTok's fate, from global tariffs to the possibility of sending troops overseas, even a desire to acquire Greenland.
It's ambitious, there's no doubt about that. It really does paint a picture of someone who's not afraid to shake things up on a global scale.
Absolutely. And while we can't predict the future, I think this document gives us a pretty good idea of a possible future for U.S. policy.
Domestically and internationally.
Exactly what I was thinking. And one thing that really stands out is this constant theme of, challenging the way things have always been done.
Right, like throwing out the old playbook and saying we're going to do things differently.
But the big question is, what will the impact of all these potential changes actually be?
I think that's what makes this whole thing so fascinating and honestly a little bit unnerving.
No.
We're talking about potential shifts in everything from trade and military strategy to the very definition of citizenship and how our justice system works.
I mean, the effects of these changes could be felt for years to come.
Decades even. It's like watching a grandmaster chess player making these bold moves and the rest of us are just trying to figure out the strategy.
What's the end game here?
Exactly. And like with any complex game, there are bound to be some unintended consequences. Every action has a reaction.
So how will other countries respond to these potential shifts in U.S. policy?
That's a key question. Will they see it as strength or instability, Will it lead to more cooperation or more conflict? These are the questions we need to be asking as we watch all of this unfold.
So, listener, what are your thoughts on all of this? What stands out to you as the most surprising or maybe even concerning aspect of this potential new direction for U.S. policy? It's a lot to think about, and we'd love to hear your perspective.
As